you can kill somebody pretty easy if you have the mindset for it.
Of America's most chilling serial killers emerged after investigators, journalists, and true crime researchers revisited archived interviews, court records, and recorded statements made by Gary Ray Bowles. For years, the case had sat in the shadows of more widely known murder sprees. But when people listened again to the killer's own words, many were struck by the same disturbing realization. There was no panic in his voice, no visible remorse, no emotion that matched the horrors he had left behind. Gary Ray Bowles had become known as the I-95 killer, a predator who moved along one of the busiest highways on the East Coast during the mid-1990s. His victims were targeted across multiple states. His crimes created fear among investigators who struggled to understand how one man could seemingly appear, kill, disappear, and repeat the cycle again. To the public, Bowles was a monster. To law enforcement, he was a moving target. But to himself, that was the terrifying question. As detectives pieced together his history, they discovered a childhood marked by instability, violence, and trauma. Yet countless people endure hardship without becoming killers. What transformed Gary Ray Bowles into a man capable of taking multiple lives remained a mystery investigators would spend years trying to solve. By the spring of 1994, Bowles was drifting from state to state. He often met men in bars and social spaces, earning trust before exploiting it. At first glance, he appeared unremarkable. He could be charming when necessary, friendly when it benefited him. But beneath that surface was a growing pattern of manipulation and violence. The first known murder in the spree shocked investigators. The victim was brutally beaten. Evidence suggested a level of rage far beyond simple robbery. Detectives searched for motives, connections, and witnesses, but answers came slowly. Then another victim appeared. And another. The bodies began forming a trail, stretching along Interstate 95. Each new crime scene deepened the mystery. Each victim represented another life stolen without warning. Investigators from different states initially struggled to connect the cases. Jurisdictional boundaries created delays. Evidence was scattered. Witness descriptions varied. Meanwhile, the killer kept moving. The fear among law enforcement wasn't simply that a serial killer existed. It was that he seemed to be learning. Every successful escape gave him confidence. Every unsolved murder bought him more time. Years later, when recordings of Bowles speaking about parts of his life resurfaced, listeners noticed something unsettling. He often discussed events with an emotional distance that felt impossible to comprehend. There was no dramatic confession, no cinematic breakdown, just a cold recounting of choices that ended lives. As detectives reviewed timelines and travel patterns, they realized they weren't hunting a man acting on impulse. They were hunting someone who appeared capable of compartmentalizing murder and everyday life with terrifying ease. He could kill, then move on, then kill again. And for a period of time, nobody knew where he would strike next. If you're fascinated by true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of criminal investigations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to True Crime Log, and share your thoughts in the comments. Cases like this remind us how dangerous a predator can become when they remain hidden in plain sight. But the worst part of the story was what investigators already knew. It was what they were about to discover. Because as the victim count climbed, evidence began revealing a horrifying pattern. And once detectives finally understood who they were hunting, they realized the killer had already chosen his next target. The investigation intensified as authorities compared evidence across multiple states. What initially looked like isolated murders was becoming something far more sinister. A serial killer was traveling freely along the East Coast. and he was leaving bodies behind him. Each victim shared similarities that detectives could no longer ignore. The attacks were violent, personal, brutal. The killer often gained access through trust, then transformed into a nightmare. For investigators, one of the most disturbing aspects was the unpredictability. Bowles didn't appear tied to one neighborhood, city, or county. He was mobile, constantly moving, constantly adapting. That mobility gave him a terrifying advantage. While detectives worked leads in one state, he could already be hundreds of miles away. By the time connections became clearer, several lives had already been lost. As authorities dug deeper into Bowles's background, they found a history filled with criminal behavior and violence. Encounters with law enforcement stretched back years, yet nothing fully prepared investigators for the scale of what they were uncovering. The murders weren't random explosions of anger. Evidence suggested planning, selection, opportunity, control. Years later, recordings and documented statements attributed to Bowles revealed a chilling mindset. Those who studied his interviews frequently noted how matter-of-fact he could sound when discussing events surrounding the crimes. That emotional detachment haunted many who listened. The victims, meanwhile, became more than names in case files. They were sons, friends, family members, people who had routines, dreams, and futures. One moment they were alive. The next, their loved ones were facing unimaginable loss. As the body count grew, media coverage expanded. Communities along Interstate 95 became increasingly alarmed. Rumors spread. Fear spread faster. Was the killer nearby? Had anyone crossed paths with him? Could another murder happen tonight? For law enforcement, the pressure was enormous. Every day without an arrest carried the possibility of another victim. Every missed lead felt catastrophic. Investigators worked long hours, comparing witness statements and examining travel routes. Gradually, a profile emerged. The killer wasn't simply wandering. He was navigating, choosing locations, finding opportunities, disappearing before authorities could catch up. Then came a breakthrough. A witness description, physical evidence, pieces that finally began fitting together. For the first time, investigators felt they were closing in. Yet even then, Bowles remained elusive. Like a ghost moving between states. Like a predator always one step ahead. What made the case especially unsettling was the contrast between appearance and reality. People who encountered him often didn't describe someone obviously dangerous. That's one of the hardest truths in many serial killer investigations. Monsters rarely look like monsters. They blend in. They smile. They converse. And sometimes they earn trust before destroying it. As the net tightened around Bowles, authorities knew the hunt was entering a critical stage. Either they would catch him, or someone else would die. If you're watching right now, comment below with the case that shocked you the most, and don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Log for more deep-dive investigations into real criminal cases. At this point in the story, investigators believed they were getting closer than ever. But what they didn't know was that Bowles was becoming increasingly desperate. And desperate killers often become even more dangerous. The final phase of the manhunt was about to begin. By late 1994, the walls were closing in. Investigators had connected key evidence. Witnesses had provided critical information. And Gary Ray Bowles was no longer an unknown suspect drifting through the system. He had become one of the most wanted men, connected to a serial murder investigation. Across multiple jurisdictions, law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts to locate him. Flyers circulated, tips poured in, Every reported sighting triggered urgency. But tracking a transient fugitive is never easy, especially one who had already demonstrated a willingness to kill. Authorities knew a simple traffic stop could become deadly. Every officer involved understood the risk. Meanwhile, media attention continued growing. The public wanted answers. Families wanted justice. Investigators wanted the killings to stop. Eventually, the breakthrough arrived. Bowles was captured. For many, the arrest felt like a collective exhale after months of fear. But the investigation was far from over. In many ways, it was only beginning. Now detectives faced an entirely different challenge: understanding the man behind the murders. Interviews followed. Questions followed. And the responses often left investigators disturbed. Not because of emotional outbursts, but because of the absence of them. People expect killers to appear visibly haunted by their crimes. Yet in many documented accounts, Bowles projected an unsettling calmness, a composure that seemed disconnected from the devastation surrounding the case. Families of victims were forced to endure court proceedings and revelations that reopened wounds. Details emerged that painted a horrifying picture of violence. Every fact uncovered represented another painful reminder of lives stolen. The legal process moved forward. Evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. Prosecutors built their case. And throughout it all, the victims remained at the center of the proceedings. The focus wasn't merely on what Bowles had done. It was on whom he had taken. The human cost of the murders was impossible to ignore. Courtrooms became places where grief and justice collided. For family members, no sentence could restore what had been lost. No verdict could bring loved ones back. Still, accountability mattered. Truth mattered. The opportunity to confront the reality of the crimes mattered. As years passed, researchers, journalists, and true crime investigators continued examining Bowles' statements and behavior. One recurring observation stood out. His words often felt detached from the emotional weight of the murders. Listeners searched for regret, for empathy, for acknowledgement of suffering. What they often found instead was a coldness that made the crimes feel even more disturbing. Because when violence is paired with emotional indifference, it creates a different kind of fear. The fear that some people can commit horrific acts without fully confronting the humanity of their victims. If you're finding this case as disturbing as many investigators did, make sure to like the video and subscribe to True Crime Log. Your support helps us continue exploring the stories behind some of history's most notorious criminal cases. But one chapter still remained unwritten. The final chapter. The moment when the man responsible for the murders would face the consequences of his actions. And years later, the words he left behind would continue raising questions that remain unsettling even today. After years of legal proceedings and appeals, Gary Ray Bowles ultimately faced the sentence imposed by the courts. For the families of victims, the passage of time did little to erase the pain. Birthdays still arrived. Holidays still came and went. Empty chairs still reminded loved ones of what had been taken. The case never truly ended for them. It simply changed shape. Meanwhile, public fascination with serial killers continued growing. Documentaries, books, and investigations revisited the crimes repeatedly. Yet one danger always exists when discussing offenders: the risk of focusing so heavily on the killer that the victims become secondary. In reality, the most important people in this story were never the murderer. They were the individuals whose lives were cut short. The people who should have had decades ahead of them. As archived interviews and statements resurfaced over the years, listeners continued analyzing Bowles's demeanor. Many were struck by how ordinary he could sound while discussing extraordinary horrors. That contrast remains one of the most chilling elements of the case. Not dramatic rage, not theatrical evil, just a frightening absence of visible remorse. For criminal psychologists, cases like this often spark difficult debates. Can a person's history explain their actions? Perhaps. Can it excuse them? No. Millions of people experience hardship without becoming violent predators. Ultimately, responsibility rests with the choices that were made. And Gary Ray Bowles made choices that destroyed lives. By 2026, renewed interest in the case led a new generation of true crime followers to examine the investigation from beginning to end. They studied the evidence, the timeline, the interviews. Many arrived at the same conclusion. The most unsettling aspect wasn't necessarily how he killed. It was how easily he seemed able to move forward afterward. As though murder could be compartmentalized. As though human life could be reduced to an obstacle. That realization continues haunting investigators long after the case itself has ended. Because serial killer cases force society to confront uncomfortable truths. Predators can appear ordinary. Danger doesn't always announce itself. And sometimes the people capable of the greatest harm are the ones who initially seem the least threatening. The victims in this case deserved more time, more memories, more life. Instead, their stories became part of one of America's most disturbing serial murder investigations. Today, their names and experiences remain an essential part of understanding what happened. Not because we should remember the killer, but because we should remember those he harmed. As this story comes to a close, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to True Crime Log if you want more deeply researched true crime documentaries. Every discussion helps keep the focus where it belongs, on the pursuit of truth and the memory of victims. And perhaps that's the final lesson hidden within this case. Long after the headlines fade, long after courtrooms empty, long after the killer's voice falls silent, the echoes of the crimes remain, not in the words of the man who committed them, but in the lives forever changed by what he did. And that is the part of the story that never truly ends.